Inaugural poetry is a curious phenomenon, and it's something we've been talking about for the last few videos. It's a way that a president who's coming into office can set an aesthetic vision for what they want to do. And it's a way for poetry to have a national stage. You know, one of the things that I thought has been interesting in some of the feedback to my video I did a couple videos ago on Amanda Gorman is people kind of came and said, well, she's not a very good poet. She's young. She's untested. Why are you praising her? And I found it a little amusing because one of the things that I've said as we've started this channel is I think poetry is so outside of most people's consciousnesses in America that I find it amusing that whenever somebody brings up a poet, there's a contingency that says, well, they're not the best poet, so why are you talking about them? We're not going to talk about the best poets today because Obama, like Clinton before him, was a little idiosyncratic in the poets he chose. So we're going to talk about two poets and two poems in this video. I want to make sure that it's clear that when we talk about inaugural poetry, we're not necessarily talking about the best poets writing the best poems in America. What we're talking about is poetry that has become very public. Inaugural poetry is one of the only times that many Americans hear poetry or even learn about the names of living poets in their life. So I want to promote in this channel poetry that's public, poetry that's engaging, poetry that people who maybe don't know a lot about poetry can connect with and think about and mull over. So we will talk about the greatest poets of every generation. But if you're worried that hearing me talk about a poet who you don't think is the best poet, or maybe even is a mediocre poet, if you're worried that that somehow means that I'm telling you they're the best poet ever, settle down. We're talking about inaugural poets because I think it's an interesting phenomenon and I want to know more about it myself, and through learning about it myself and talking to you, I feel like I'm promoting literacy when it comes to poetry in a way that is needed in our culture. So, Barack Obama is elected president in 2008, and for his 2009 inauguration, he chooses a poet to read named Elizabeth Alexander. Now, Elizabeth Alexander, as we just mentioned, perhaps wouldn't have been my pick for poet, and yet she gives us a really interesting inaugural poem, which takes inauguration poetry in a new direction. We've seen Robert Frost reading a very formal poem, The Gift Outright, a little bit triumphalist about the American colonies and the American Revolution. We've seen Maya Angelou and Miller Williams give 90s free verse that flirts with rhyme, but not so much, that talks about the complicated past of America, and both gave us a call to step into the future and make an America for the next generation, which is better than what came before. Elizabeth Alexander gives us a taste of very popular poetic style in the early 2000s, which is straightforward language, free verse, very concrete imagery, that's not very monumental in how it talks. Here's a taste of it. This is called Praise Song for the Day by Elizabeth Alexander. Each day we go about our business, walking past each other, catching each other's eyes or not, about to speak or speaking. All about us is noise, all about us is noise and bramble, thorn and din, each one of our ancestors on our tongues. Someone is stitching up a hem, darning a hole in a uniform, patching a tire, repairing the things in need of repair. Someone is trying to make music somewhere, with a pair of wooden spoons on an oil drum, with cello, boombox, harmonica, voice. A woman and her son wait for the bus. A farmer considers the changing sky. A teacher says, "Take out your pencil, begin." So this is very common language, and poetry that was popular around the turn of the century in the late 90s into the first decade of the 2000s was very much this type of poetry, very what we would call demotic language, a language of the people. And we see here a catalog, we talked about catalogs in the last video that Maya Angelou does, of all the different ethnicities and religions and types of people represented in America. This is a little more of a mundane catalog. We get a picture of what people are doing across America. We have the woman and her son, the farmer, the teacher, the musician, the boombox, the harmonica. It's a multiplicity of American types, and yet we have these descriptions that Alexander is giving us throughout that are suggestive of bigger principles. A teacher says, "Take out your pencil, begin." We have people repairing the things in need of repair. Obviously, this is supposed to make us think not just of the individual jobs of these people, but the job of America. How do we take out our pencil and begin? How do we repair the things in need of repair? So I think that Alexander is pointing us toward a very common American speech and common American types. So Alexander, she was criticized, similar to Amanda Gorman after her. She was criticized for giving us a boring poem. And yet I think that it's the type of poem that's interested much more in the details of the common everyday than giving us monumental images of the dinosaur, the mastodon, the rock, the river, and the tree. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you're more of an Angelou imagery fan or Elizabeth Alexander imagery fan. But Alexander is calling us to, well, very much to a common human desire to make things a little better, to be in a world that's a little better and a little brighter. And this idea that it's morning in America, that we have in Maya Angelou, we get it also in Elizabeth Alexander. This the day is moving forward. The next inaugural poet, who actually it works with this day imagery as well, is Richard Blanco. So Richard Blanco was chosen to read at the 2013 inauguration of Obama. And he really leans into this imagery of the day. And in Elizabeth Alexander, it's each day we go about our business and sort of pictures from a day, from the daytime. But Blanco becomes much more interested in mapping out a whole cycle of the day from the morning to the evening. So this is how Richard Blanco's One Today goes. One sun rose on us today, kindled over our shores, peeking over the Smokies, greeting the faces of the Great Lakes, spreading a simple truth across the Great Plains, then charging across the Rockies, one light waking up rooftops, under each one a story told by our silent gestures moving behind windows. My face, your face, millions of faces in morning mirrors, each one yawning to life, crescendoing into our day, pencil yellow school buses, the rhythm of traffic lights, fruit stands, apples, limes, and oranges arrayed like rainbows, begging our praise. Silver trucks heavy with oil or paper, bricks or milk, teeming over highways alongside us on our way to clean tables, read ledgers, or save lives, to teach geometry or ring up groceries as my mother did for 20 years, so I could write this poem. Blanco's doing a fascinating thing. He's picking up on Elizabeth Alexander's catalog of different types, Maya Angelou as well. And yet he's giving us a little richer imagery. You can notice his diction, and if you read his lines, they're a little longer and lusher than Alexander's. Alexander pointed us to the very common speech of America. Blanco is giving it a little more amplification. And he has this interesting turn where he gives us an autobiographical glimpse, right? He wants to give us this catalog of American types, but he wants to remind us, my mother was one of these types, and she bagged groceries so I could write this poem. It's a curious thing that, in fact, we don't have in any other inaugural poems before, except for a little bit in Frost's poem he didn't read all of, where he talks about, I have been called here today. And yet there's a little more intimacy in Blanco's poem, which I really, really appreciate. So there's an amplification of catalog again later in Blanco's poem, where he says, for each other all day, saying hello, shalom, buongiorno, howdy, namaste, or buenos dias, in the language my mother taught me, in every language spoken into one wind, carrying our lives without prejudice as these words break from my lips. So he gives us the catalog not just of people going to work and the different works they do, which we get in Elizabeth Alexander too, he gives us a sense of the polyvocality and the polylinguistic nature of America. And he brings it back to his own self too. In every language spoken into one wind, in the language my mother taught me, these words break from my lips. He's both speaking for America, speaking to America, and speaking from a very particularized background in America. And so Blanco's, I think, trying to sum up a lot of what's come before. So let's look at maybe a big picture here. Inaugural poets have a problem, I think, and that problem is they have to be positive. They have to end with hope. But whenever you get into the details and the maybe the harsh realities of daily life in America, there's always this tendency to say, uh-oh, there are brambles. Now, it's interesting that brambles is a word that's used both by Elizabeth Alexander and by Miller Williams, this idea of the bramble standing in for the troubling thing in the American past, the thing that's thorny. How do you be positive, be hopeful, when you know that America is complicated, and when you know that the guy that's sitting next to you who just got inaugurated president, you don't know how they're going to do. You're hopeful for them, and I think from JFK and Robert Frost onward, the inaugural poets have really encouraged hopefulness about, well, we'll see how this guy does. But I think it's a new day. I think it's a new dawn. I think we're going to be better than we've been. We're going to move beyond our problems and our prejudices. And yet, I think that the listening public, and sometimes even more official criticism from pundits, other poets, has often been, yeah, you're straying into propaganda. A new era of poetry and power is I think the most bombastic phrase we get in an inaugural poem from Robert Frost. And yet, I think it's difficult to write a poem for an inauguration and not slip into that a little bit of sloganeering. And I think it really is the job of the poet. I think Blanco does this very well, of saying, okay, how do I give this language that we're used to? It's a new day in America. We'll move forward in hope. The sins of the past will not hold us back from the virtues of the present. How do I say these things in a way that really does fit with the rhetoric of a campaign, but not just make it sound prettier, but ennoble it with language? Some might be cynical and say, it's not possible to be an inaugural poet without compromising your vision. I want you to think about it. It's something that I'm troubled by and I'm interested in. Official poetry about politics and about political situations. How do you write it well? How do you be clear about it? Elizabeth Alexander and Miller Williams take a very straightforward language of the people approach. Maya Angelou, Robert Frost, Richard Blanco take a little bit more of an exalted approach in their language. But in the end, these are poems that are trying to do a lot. And I think we should think about them. Thanks for hanging out. We'll do one more, which comes up to the era of Biden and looks at Amanda Gorman's poem in more detail than we have before. Thank you so much for spending time with us.